In May 2009, a small team from the Scottish Wildlife Trust opened crates on the shore of 3 remote lochs in Knapdale Forest, Argyll, and released 11 Eurasian beavers onto Scottish soil for the first time in more than 400 years. Within months, those 11 animals had started building. By 2014, they had transformed quiet stretches of water into wetland systems that no living person in Scotland had ever seen functioning before. By 2020, monitoring teams documented that water vole populations had quadrupled in beaver-influenced sites, macroinvertebrate richness had risen by nearly 80%. Peak flood flows had been reduced by an average of 60% in modeled storm scenarios, and species that had not been recorded in the area for decades, amphibians, reed buntings, and otters, were colonizing the new wetlands. The 11 beavers had not just survived, they had reorganized the hydrology of a forest that had been running without them since before Shakespeare was born. This is the full story, from the medieval extinction that erased these animals to the 5-year scientific gamble to bring them back, to what the monitoring data is now revealing about how a single keystone species can rewrite the rules of an entire watershed in less than a decade. Most videos about beaver reintroductions show you the splash of a tail and call it a success. This one follows the data 16 years deep into the failed first applications, the genetic bottleneck that almost ended the project, the 2 beavers that died in the first year, the political battle that made beavers legally protected only after years of debate, and the scientific evidence of what 11 animals actually did to a Scottish forest given 5 years and no human help. Every claim in this video is sourced from the Scottish Wildlife Trust's official final report, Nature Scott's independent monitoring program, peer-reviewed research published in journals including Hydrological Processes and Evolutionary Applications, and the 2015 Beavers in Scotland report submitted to the Scottish Government. This is not speculation. This is what 16 years of field measurements actually recorded. But before you can understand what the beavers are doing now, you need to understand what Scotland lost when they disappeared, and why bringing them back was one of the most contested wildlife decisions in modern British history. The Eurasian beaver is not a passive resident. It is what scientists formally classify as an ecosystem engineer, a species whose physical activities reshape the landscape so profoundly that they create habitat for dozens of other species. An adult Eurasian beaver weighs between 16 and 30 kilograms, roughly the size of a medium dog. It has self-sharpening orange incisors capable of felling trees more than 30 centimeters in diameter. It builds dams from sticks, branches, and packed mud, raising water levels behind the structure to create ponds where it constructs lodges with underwater entrances for protection from predators. It digs canals to float heavy logs. It creates wetlands where there were streams. It opens forest canopies where it fells trees, allowing light to reach the ground and triggering new plant growth. But here is what makes the beaver irreplaceable. It does not just live in a habitat, it builds the habitat, and once built, that habitat supports an entirely different community of species than the running water that existed before, including water voles, otters, amphibians, dragonflies, sedge warblers, reed buntings, and a documented surge in aquatic invertebrates that forms the base of the entire food web. Later in this video, you will see exactly what 11 beavers did to Knapdale's hydrology in just 5 years. The numbers are unlike anything British conservationists had seen at this scale before. But first, how Scotland lost these animals in the first place. When you remove an ecosystem engineer like the beaver for 4 centuries, you do not just lose a species, you lose every wetland process that depended on it. And Scotland lost those processes deliberately. Eurasian beavers were hunted across Britain throughout the medieval period for their dense waterproof fur, for their meat, and for castoreum, a glandular secretion used in perfumes and folk medicine. By the 16th century, the species was effectively extinct across the entire United Kingdom. Across Europe, the same pattern played out. By 1880, the beaver population in Norway, the country that would eventually supply Scotland's reintroduction stock, had collapsed to between 60 and 120 surviving individuals. The species was nearly wiped from the continent. Scotland's beavers vanished so completely that for over 400 years, the wetlands they had created drained, the ponds they had maintained dried out, and the watercourses they had shaped reverted to fast-flowing channels. The landscape that survived into the modern era was narrow, eroded, and fast-draining, with streams cutting through forest. It was not the natural Scottish ecosystem. It was the aftermath of beaver removal on a continental scale. What Scotland did next would take 19 years of debate, 2 failed applications, intense political opposition from landowners and angling interests, and depend on the cooperation of a country whose own beaver population had only narrowly avoided extinction, and it almost did not happen. The first proposal to reintroduce beavers to Scotland was floated in the 1990s. A formal application for a trial release was submitted in 2002 and rejected. Concerns came from multiple directions. Angling associations worried about effects on salmon populations, farmers worried about flooding of agricultural land, foresters worried about damage to commercial timber. The application that finally succeeded was submitted by the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, and it was approved by the Scottish Government only in May 2008. It would be the first legally authorized mammal reintroduction anywhere in the United Kingdom. The program was built on precise science. In 2008, a team from the Norwegian University of Telemark captured 17 wild Eurasian beavers in the Telemark region of southern Norway. The animals were transported to specialist quarantine facilities in Devon, England, where they spent 6 months under veterinary observation to ensure they carried no pathogens that could spread to native British wildlife. Knapdale Forest, on the west coast of Argyll, was selected as the release site for 2 specific reasons. First, its mosaic of small lochs and burns offered ideal beaver habitat. Second, its surrounding geomorphology, with sea on 3 sides and mountains and unsuitable terrain elsewhere, was predicted to act as a natural barrier, preventing the beavers from dispersing widely while the trial was ongoing. On the 28th and 29th of May, 2009, 3 family groups totaling 11 beavers were released into 3 separate freshwater lochs within Knapdale: Loch Coilabha, Loch An Buick, and Loch Linna. Within days, an estimated 10 million people in Britain had read, heard, or watched coverage of the release. The question was not whether the beavers would attract attention, it was whether they would survive and whether they would build. What happened next took just 1 year, and it produced an outcome that the cautious press releases of the planning phase had not dared to predict. In 2010, the first beaver kit was born at Knapdale. It was the first wild-born beaver on Scottish soil since the 1500s. The symmetry was not just symbolic. It was biological proof that Norwegian beavers, animals that had never seen a Scottish loch before May 2009, had not just survived their first winter in a foreign country. They had bonded, established territory, and reproduced. The same animals that had been transported across the North Sea in crates were now doing the one thing the entire trial depended on: making more beavers. But the trial was not a smooth success. The beavers behaved like beavers, which meant they did exactly what some opponents had feared. They felled trees, they built dams in places that flooded paths. 2 of the original 11 died in the first year. Losses that, for a population this small, posed an immediate genetic threat. The Scottish Beaver Trials Veterinary Monitoring Program, one of the most thorough ever implemented for a mammal reintroduction in Europe, documented every health issue, every dispersal, every kit born and lost. By the end of the field monitoring period in 2014, only 9 beavers were known to remain at Knapdale. The trial had succeeded in proving the species could survive in modern Scotland. But the population was small, isolated, and as later genetic analysis would confirm, at serious risk of inbreeding. At least 1 father-daughter pairing was documented. The Norwegian source population, having gone through its own historical bottleneck, had given Knapdale's beavers some of the lowest genetic diversity ever recorded in Eurasian beavers. The biggest surprise was not the threats. It was what the surviving beavers were doing to the forest while the politicians argued. In November 2016, the Scottish government announced that beavers would be allowed to remain in Scotland. In 2018, they were granted European Protected Species status. And in 2017, a second program, the Scottish Beavers Reinforcement Project, began translocating additional beavers to Knapdale to rescue the population genetically. Over 3 years, 21 more beavers were released, many of them captured from human-wildlife conflict sites elsewhere in Scotland, where earlier illegal releases had established populations of Bavarian-origin beavers. By the project's end in 2020, the Knapdale population had grown, new families were breeding, and for the first time, the trial population had genetic diversity from 2 distinct European source populations. A 2024 peer-reviewed study published in Evolutionary Applications, titled "The Genetic Legacy of the First Successful Reintroduction of a Mammal to Britain," formally documented what had happened. The original 16 Norwegian source animals had carried Norway's bottlenecked genetics into Knapdale. Without the reinforcement project, the population's long-term viability had been seriously in doubt. With it, the foundation for a self-sustaining Scottish beaver population was finally in place. Then NatureScot's monitoring program began publishing what the beavers had actually done to the landscape. And that is where the story gets truly interesting. Because what the data showed was not just a species surviving. It was a watershed being engineered in real time by animals working with nothing but mud, sticks, and instinct, producing measurable hydrological and ecological effects that the modeling had only partially predicted. The first surprise was hydrological. A multi-site study published in 2020 in the journal Hydrological Processes by Puttock and colleagues documented something extraordinary about beaver dams. They attenuate flow. Across multiple beaver-modified sites in Britain, peak flood flows were reduced significantly during heavy rain events. In modeled scenarios with dense beaver dam networks, peak flows during major winter storms were reduced by averages approaching 60%. Even in more moderate rain events, flood peaks were delayed by hours, giving downstream areas more time and reducing the violence of the water pulse. Water that once rushed downhill in fast-eroding channels began lingering in ponds, sinking into soil, and spreading gently across meadows. This is significant. In a country where climate change is making rainfall more intense and flooding more frequent, the beavers were not just creating wetlands, they were rebuilding the natural flood defenses that had existed across Britain for millennia before the species was wiped out. And that was only the hydrological surprise. What the beavers did to the rest of the food web was something else entirely. NatureScot's long-term monitoring of water voles, a species of high conservation concern in Britain, in steep decline across most of its range, documented a quadrupling of the water vole index in beaver-influenced sites at Knapdale. The trapping grid data showed captures rising from just over 1 per 100 trap nights to more than 5 per 100 trap nights over the decade following the beaver release. Water voles had thrived because the beavers had created exactly the kind of habitat they need: tangled bankside vegetation, slow water with emergent sedges, and soft soils suitable for burrowing. The same effects rippled through other species. Macroinvertebrate species richness, the total diversity of aquatic insects, crustaceans, and other small creatures that form the base of freshwater food webs, rose by nearly 80% in streams influenced by the beavers. Amphibians gained new breeding pools in the still water behind dams. Otters hunted in the slow waters where fish populations had increased. Reed buntings and sedge warblers, birds that depend on dense wetland vegetation, settled into the new growth. Across the board, biodiversity at Knapdale increased, not because anyone planted anything or released any other species, but because 11 beavers had built the habitat that everything else needed. The full dimensions of the change are still being measured. 16 years of monitoring data from Knapdale represents one of the most comprehensive single-site beaver reintroduction datasets in Europe. What it reveals about how rapidly an ecosystem engineer can reshape a landscape and how broadly that reshaping affects other species is still being analyzed, but the direction is unmistakable. The third surprise was political. The Scottish beaver trial had been intended as a small, contained experiment. It became something much larger, the legal and scientific foundation for beavers to be recognized as native species across Scotland, and the model for similar reintroductions now underway across England, Wales, and other parts of Europe. What happened at Knapdale changed British conservation policy. NatureScot's most recent beaver management report, covering April 2024 to March 2025, documents an active national framework for beaver management that did not exist before the trial proved it was possible. The Scottish Gaelic name for the beaver is Baobha, or Lochs, the broad-tailed one. Those names survived the extinction. For more than 4 centuries, the words existed in the language without the animal they described. The lochs and burns and forests of Argyll carried names for a creature that no living Scot had ever seen building a dam in a Scottish loch. Now the animal is back. The words mean something again. And the dams being built across the small lochs of Knapdale, made from sticks dragged from the forest, packed with mud and reeds, and raised season after season, are reshaping the hydrology of that forest in ways that will only deepen as the colonies grow. If the pattern continues, those dams could persist for decades. The wetlands they have created could persist for generations. 11 beavers, 16 years. A reintroduction that started in 3 small lochs and produced the legal framework for an entire country's relationship with a long-lost native species, and a population that is now writing its own future across the watersheds of Western Scotland without anyone opening a crate. But Scotland is not the only place where a returned species is reshaping a landscape in ways scientists did not predict. In our next video, we go to a coast where 245 eagles were released onto a shoreline that had not seen them in over a century. What the satellite data revealed about their behavior is still being studied today. If you thought 11 beavers could change a forest, wait until you see what an apex predator does to an entire country, given 18 years of release data. You will not look at ecosystem recovery the same way again.